The morning I first saw him, I dropped an entire tray of coffee. Not because of him. Not yet. It was because of her. She had walked into Briarwood Diner at 7:14 on a Tuesday, and something about the way she moved made every instinct in my body go still. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, with silver hair swept back in a careful knot, and eyes the precise color of a winter sky. Pale blue, almost gray, the kind that seemed to hold weather inside them. She wore a coat that was clearly expensive, dark charcoal wool with brass buttons, entirely out of place among our laminated menus and sticky syrup dispensers. She sat herself at table 4 without waiting to be seated, folded her hands on the tabletop, and looked around the diner with an expression that wasn't quite disdain and wasn't quite curiosity. It was something more careful than either. I picked up the ceramic mugs and the spilled coffee with the hem of my apron and told myself to focus. Briarwood wasn't a remarkable place. It sat on the edge of the smaller side of town, the side that didn't have the gated neighborhoods or the private roads that led up into the forested hills. And it smelled permanently of burnt butter and dish soap and the particular sweetness of maple syrup that never fully left the air no matter how many times we mopped. I had worked here for 3 years. I knew every crack in the tile floor, every customer who took their eggs scrambled versus over easy, every draft that came through the back door in November. I knew this place the way you know something you've stopped really seeing. I grabbed my notepad and crossed the diner toward table 4. She didn't look up when I approached, which wasn't unusual. Most people were on their phones by then, or staring out the window, or deep in the private landscape of their own thoughts. But when I stopped beside her table and said good morning, "Can I get you something to drink?" she still didn't look up. I waited. The diner hummed around us. The sizzle from the kitchen, the low murmur of the couple at the counter, the radio playing something old and indistinct from somewhere behind the pie display. I said it again, a little louder. "Good morning." She finally looked up, and the moment she did, I understood. Her eyes moved across my mouth with the particular focused attention of someone who had spent a lifetime reading lips. There was no self-consciousness in it. It was simply how she received the world. Practiced, precise, patient. She gave a small nod and held up 2 fingers, then touched her cup. She was deaf. Something shifted in my chest. Not pity. Nothing like that. It was more like recognition. The particular loneliness of being in a room full of people who speak a language that doesn't reach you. I knew that feeling from a different angle, the way you know the shape of a room in the dark. I set down my notepad. And then, without thinking about it much, the way you do things that have become so deeply part of you that they require no decision, I lifted my hands and signed, "Good morning. Coffee for 2. The change in her face was immediate. Her lips parted. The careful composure she'd been wearing like that expensive coat seemed to soften all at once, and what came through underneath was something raw and bright and completely unguarded. Her hands rose from the table and she signed back, quickly, with the fluency of someone for whom this was not a second language but a first one, a mother tongue. "You sign." I wasn't expecting that. I smiled and signed. I learned when I was young. My neighbor was deaf. She taught me. She studied me for a moment with those winter sky eyes, and then she smiled. A real one, the kind that changes the whole architecture of a face, and signed, "2 coffees, yes. My son is parking. He takes too long." I laughed before I could stop myself. It wasn't performative laughter, the kind you deploy with difficult customers, or the kind that comes out of nervous habit. It was genuine, surprised out of me. She saw it, and her smile widened, and for a moment we were just 2 people in an ordinary diner, sharing something small and real. I went to get the coffee. Dara, the other morning waitress, was leaning against the counter near the coffee station when I got there. She was 22 and beautiful, in a way she wasn't fully aware of yet. With dark curls she was always pushing behind her ears, and she had a habit of watching everything that happened in the diner with an expression of mild anthropological interest. "Who's the fancy lady?" she asked. "Table 4. Coffee for 2. Her son is coming." "She didn't answer you. She's deaf." Dara blinked. Oh, so how did you... She watched me pour the coffee and stopped asking the question because she'd figured out the answer. Right. The signing thing. She tilted her head. Do you think she's staying somewhere local? She doesn't look local. I don't know. I loaded the mugs onto a fresh tray, more carefully this time. She doesn't look like she's passing through either. I carried the coffee back across the diner. I was 3 steps from table 4 when the front door opened. The bell above it rang, the small brass bell that had been there since before I started, that I heard probably 200 times a day without registering it. But this time I registered it. I registered it because the air in the diner changed when he walked in. I can't explain it better than that. It was subtle, the way a change in barometric pressure is subtle. You don't see it. You feel it in your sinuses, in some animal part of your awareness that is older than thought. He was tall. That was the first thing. Not just height, but the kind of physical presence that alters the geometry of a space, the way a large piece of furniture changes a room. He wore dark clothing, leather and something heavier over the shoulders, and his hair was long, pulled back in a way that made the strong lines of his face impossible to ignore. He had blue eyes, the same pale winter sky color as his mother's, I realized, and a scar that crossed his jaw in a thin pale line. He scanned the diner the way someone scans for exits, quickly and with complete competence. And then his gaze found his mother at table 4, and something in his expression shifted. Not softness, exactly. Something more guarded than softness. Relief, maybe, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He moved toward the table. He didn't look at me. I set the coffees down. The woman, his mother, looked up at her son, and her hands moved. You took forever. I already made a friend. He glanced at me then, for the first time. It was brief, the kind of glance you give a piece of furniture that has been moved slightly out of place, noting it, filing it, moving on. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without speaking, without signing, without acknowledging me in any way beyond that single glance. I should have walked away. That was my job. Bring the coffee, take the order, keep moving. The diner had other tables. Brenda at the counter needed a refill. The couple by the window had been trying to get my attention for 4 minutes. But his mother was looking at me again, and her hands moved. Do you know who he is? I looked at her. I looked at him. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, with the concentrated attention of someone trying to hold something still inside themselves. I signed back, slowly. Should I? She smiled the way people smile when they know something you don't, and it held both warmth and the faintest edge of something I couldn't name yet. He finally looked at me properly then. He had heard nothing. The signing was silent, invisible to him unless he watched our hands. But something had shifted in the air between his mother and me, and he was too attuned to her to miss it. He looked at my hands. He looked at his mother's face. Something crossed his expression. Not quite surprise, not quite suspicion. Something more unsettled than either. You sign, he said. His voice was low. It wasn't a question. Yes, I said. He said nothing else. He just looked at me with those pale eyes, and the silence stretched between us like something with weight. And I became suddenly, uncomfortably aware that my hair was escaping its braid on the left side, that I had a coffee stain on my apron, that I was standing in a diner that smelled like burnt butter holding an empty tray. I became aware, in other words, of how small I must look to someone like him. I squared my shoulders anyway. My name is Lucy, I said. I'll be your server this morning. Can I get you anything else while you look at the menu? He held my gaze for one more second, long enough to make the moment strange, and then he looked down at the laminated menu and said nothing. His mother, across the table, was watching both of us with those quiet winter eyes, and the expression on her face was something I would spend a long time trying to understand. It looked, I thought, like the beginning of something she had already seen the end of. His name was Cassian Voss, and by noon the entire town knew he was here. I found out the way I found out most things, through Dara, who had found out through the cook, Raymond, who had overheard two men talking in the parking lot while he took his smoke break. The men had been part of a convoy, apparently. 3 black vehicles parked at careful intervals along the street outside, engines off but occupied. The kind of stillness that wasn't casual. "He's some kind of alpha," Dara said, refilling the napkin holders with the focused energy of someone delivering very important news. Like, not just a pack leader, a king, capital K, the kind other alphas answer to. I wiped down the counter and said nothing. "Lucy." She stopped and looked at me directly. "Did you hear what I said?" "I heard. You signed with his mother. She's deaf, Dara. It seemed like the right thing to do." She stared at me the way people stare when they can't tell if you're being brave or oblivious, and honestly, at that moment, I wasn't entirely sure myself. The thing about growing up on the small side of Briarwood was that you learned early which rules were invisible and which were simply unspoken. The hierarchy between wolves was both. Everyone knew it without being taught, the way you know gravity, not because someone sat you down and explained it, but because you had felt it every day of your life, pressing you gently but firmly toward the ground. Omegas didn't approach alphas. Servers didn't linger at the table of a king. You did your job, you kept your eyes low, and you did not, under any circumstances, make yourself memorable. I had made myself memorable before noon on a Tuesday. I was 24 years old, unmated, an Omega in a town that treated that particular designation the way it treated expired coupons. Technically valid, practically inconvenient, best set aside. My hair was the color of pale wheat, and I wore it in a braid that never stayed neat past 10 in the morning. I was not remarkable. I had spent a considerable amount of energy over the years, ensuring I was not remarkable. It was safer that way. And yet, they came back the next morning. I was restocking the sugar caddies when the bell above the door rang at 7:22, and I looked up and she was there again. Cassian's mother. Same charcoal coat, same careful knot of silver hair. And beside her this time was a younger woman I hadn't seen before. Early 30s, dark-haired, with the kind of posture that comes from years of standing in rooms where she needed to prove she belonged. She wore a fitted jacket and a look of composed professional alertness. She held the door for the older woman, and then followed her to table 4, as though she had always known where it was. Cassian wasn't with them. I felt something I refused to examine too closely, something that was not quite relief, and not quite disappointment, and went to get the coffee. The older woman looked up when I approached, and her face did that thing again. That opening. That warmth. Her hands rose. "You came back to work today. I was hoping." I smiled and signed. "It's where I work every day. I'm glad you came back. This is Petra," she signed, nodding toward the younger woman. "She travels with my son. She is very serious. You should try to make her laugh." Petra had been watching our hands with the focused attention of someone parsing a foreign language and not quite keeping up. She glanced between us, then at me, and said with careful professionalism, "I apologize. I don't sign. Can you tell me what she said?" "She said she's glad to be here," I told her, which was close enough to true and considerably kinder than the alternative. Petra gave a brisk nod. "Good. We'll need a table for 4. Mr. Voss and his second will be joining shortly." His second. I wrote it down on my notepad even though I didn't need to, and said I'd rearrange the corner booth to accommodate them. I was doing exactly that, pushing the small table against the larger one with the focused industry of someone who absolutely was not thinking about anything in particular. When the door opened again, and Cassian walked in. He wasn't alone. Behind him was a man roughly his size but darker in coloring. Black hair cropped close, a broad jaw, eyes that moved across the room with the same trained awareness as Cassian's. He wore his own authority differently, more openly, the way someone wears a coat they've stopped noticing. This, I would learn, was Rowan. Cassian's second, his closest lieutenant, and apparently the only person in Cassian's immediate orbit, permitted to find things funny. Cassian walked to the booth without looking at me. Rowan looked at me, then at the rearranged tables, then at me again, and said, "Nice work," with the mild, appreciative tone of someone who noticed small competencies. "Thank you," I said. Cassian sat. His mother slid in beside Petra across from him. Rowan took the end. And then there was a small moment, the kind of moment that seems ordinary but isn't, where Cassian's mother reached across the table and touched her son's hand to get his attention, and then signed something to him rapidly, her eyes cutting once in my direction. He looked at me. I was already looking at him, because I had been trying to read what she'd said. Old habit, my eyes tracking hands automatically, and I caught the tail end of it. Every morning she is here, and she is kind to me. Something moved through his expression. Not softness. I was beginning to understand that softness was not in his usual register. But something. A small, involuntary adjustment. Like a door that doesn't open but shifts slightly in its frame. "What's your name?" he said. Not "what's your name" again. Just the bare question, as though our exchange yesterday hadn't happened. "Lucy," I said. "You were here yesterday." "I work here every day." Rowan made a sound that might have been a smothered laugh. Cassian's eyes stayed on me, steady and unreadable. "My mother says you've been kind to her." "She's easy to be kind to." A pause. The diner moved around us. Plates, voices, the hiss of the griddle. But the booth felt oddly still. "How long have you signed?" he asked. "Since I was about 7. My neighbor, Mrs. Adler, was deaf. She needed someone to go to the market for her sometimes. She taught me so we could communicate." I paused. "I haven't used it as much since she moved away. Your mother is actually the first person I've signed with in a couple of years." Something shifted in his expression at that. Something brief and private that I couldn't name. "You remembered it clearly," he said. "After years." "Some things stay," I said simply. He held my gaze for a moment, and I made myself hold it back. Not boldly. I wasn't foolish enough for bold, but steadily. The way you stand in wind, not fighting it, just staying upright. Then he looked down at the menu and said, "Black coffee, eggs, whatever the cook recommends." I wrote it down and moved around the table. His mother ordered through signs and bright eyes. Petra ordered with the brisk efficiency of someone who ate to fuel rather than to enjoy. Rowan ordered the largest thing on the menu and asked if Raymond could make it twice as large. And when I said I'd ask, he grinned with a warmth so uncomplicated that it startled me slightly after 20 minutes in Cassian's gravity. Over the next 4 days, they came back every morning. It became its own small ritual, unremarkable to everyone except me. I would have their corner booth cleared and reset by 7:15. I learned that Cassian's mother, her name, I learned through signs one morning, was Alara. Took her coffee with a precise amount of cream and no sugar. I learned that Rowan was actually kind, the kind that didn't need anything back. The easy, generous warmth of someone who had never been taught to ration it. I learned that Petra was not cold, only careful, the way certain people become careful after being wrong about something important. I learned almost nothing new about Cassian. He spoke to me in the same measured, economical way every morning. He watched his mother and me sign with an expression I couldn't decode. Once, I looked up from the coffee station and found him already watching me. And he didn't look away immediately the way most people do when they're caught. He just held the eye contact for one flat second, and then returned to whatever papers Petra had set in front of him. It was Rowan who told me, on the 4th morning, quietly and without ceremony, while Cassian was in the parking lot on a call, why they were really in Briarwood. "There's a territorial negotiation happening," he said, wrapping both hands around his coffee mug. 3 border pacts, old disputes. Cassian is here to mediate. He paused. He didn't want to bring his mother. She insisted. "She seems like someone who generally gets what she insists on," I said. Rowan smiled. "She's the only person alive who can make him change his mind." He looked at me with something more careful than his usual easy expression. "She also doesn't attach to people quickly. She's been coming here every morning and she could eat at the estate. She's choosing this. I felt the weight of what he wasn't quite saying. I'm just her server, I said. Rowan looked at me the way people look when they know you know better. Sure, he said simply, and drank his coffee. That afternoon, after my shift, I walked home through the part of town where the streets narrowed and the trees grew close to the pavement, and the light came through in slanted columns. I kept thinking about the way Alara's face had changed when I signed to her that first morning. That sudden, unguarded opening. The specific relief of being understood in your own language. I thought about Cassian watching us. That careful, unreadable attention. I thought about Rowan's quiet shore. And I thought about the meeting I'd overheard through the diner's thin walls that afternoon. 2 of the border pack alphas who'd come in for lunch, voices low and edged, one of them saying if Voss thinks an Omega mediator is going to hold this territory together, he's already lost it. The other one laughing in a way that wasn't quite a laugh. I hadn't looked up from the plates I was carrying, but my hands had tightened on the tray. The negotiation broke down on a Thursday. I didn't know that's what had happened at first. I only knew that Cassian walked into the diner at 11:40. Not the usual morning hour, not with Rowan or Petra or Alara, alone, and sat at the counter instead of the booth. He set both forearms flat on the surface and stared at the space between them with the concentrated stillness of a man holding something very heavy very quietly. Raymond, visible through the kitchen window, caught my eye and gave me a look that said, "Your problem." I poured a coffee without being asked and set it in front of him. He didn't acknowledge it. He also didn't leave. He just sat there in that contained, pressurized silence, and I went about the business of the mid-morning lull, wiping tables, restocking, pretending with great professionalism that the most powerful alpha in the region was not sitting at my counter, looking like the sky before a serious storm. After several minutes, he said, without looking up, "Do you always pour coffee before someone asks?" "For people who look like they need it," I said. "You looked like you needed it." A pause. Then, unexpectedly, "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone paying attention." He looked up at that. The pale eyes again, direct and assessing, but something slightly different in them today. Some of the careful distance worn thinner, like paint on a much-used surface. "And you pay attention," he said. "It's useful in my job." "I think it's useful to you generally," he said. And the observation was so precise and so unexpected that I felt it land somewhere behind my sternum. I said nothing. He looked back down at his coffee. "The alpha of the Grayfen pack," he said after a moment, "believes the Clearwater territory belongs to him by ancestral claim. The alpha of Clearwater believes the same, in reverse. They've believed this for 11 years. He paused. They will believe it for another 11 if something doesn't shift. I wasn't sure why he was telling me this. I also wasn't sure I was supposed to ask, so I didn't. I leaned against the counter at a careful distance and listened. "Rowan thinks I should make a ruling and enforce it. Petra has 3 diplomatic frameworks she prepared before we arrived." He turned the coffee mug slowly in his hands. "Neither approach touches the actual problem." "What's the actual problem?" I asked. He looked at me again. This time the assessment in his eyes had a different quality. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. As though he'd asked himself a rhetorical question and hadn't expected an answer from the room. "They don't trust each other," he said. "They don't trust that the other one will honor whatever's decided," I said. "That's different from not agreeing about the territory." The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. He was very still. "Yes," he said. "It is different." I refilled his coffee even though he'd barely touched it, because I needed something to do with my hands. "What would you do?" he asked. The question was so direct that it took me a moment to process it. Me. He was asking me. I was a waitress in a diner that smelled like syrup and dish soap, and the Alpha King was asking me what I would do about an 11-year territorial dispute. I thought about it honestly instead of deflecting. "I'd find something they both need that neither of them can get alone," I said. Not a compromise. Compromises feel like losing to people like that. Something that makes cooperation more valuable than the fight. I paused. Is there anything like that? A shared resource? A shared threat? Something on those borders that affects both territories equally? He looked at me for a long time. The Aldenvale corridor, he said slowly, as though he was testing the words as he said them. It's a passage between both territories. Neither pack controls it fully. There's been a third faction moving through it. Not aggressively, not yet, but enough to notice. Then that's your leverage, I said. Not the land they're fighting over. The land they're both ignoring. He was quiet for long enough that I started to feel the particular self-consciousness of having said too much. I was reaching for something to walk it back with when he said, very quietly, "That is not something either Petra or Rowan suggested." "I'm not a diplomat," I said. "I just serve people for a living. You notice things about what people actually want versus what they say they want." Something shifted in his expression. That door again, moving slightly in its frame. He stayed at the counter for another 20 minutes. We didn't talk much more. He drank the coffee slowly, and I let the silence be what it was, which was surprisingly comfortable. Like a room you've been in long enough that the proportions start to feel familiar. When he left, he set a bill on the counter that was 3 times the cost of 2 coffees and was gone before I could say anything about it. Ilara found me that afternoon. Not in the diner. I had finished my shift, and I was at the small market 2 streets over, the one with the wooden bins of apples out front that smelled incredible in October. I was comparing 2 apples with the focused consideration of someone who had very little else to think about when I became aware that I was being watched. She was standing near the entrance, a canvas bag over one arm, and Petra a precise 3 steps behind her. When I looked up, she raised one hand and signed, "I was hoping to find you." I set the apple down and signed back. "Is everything all right?" She crossed the small distance between us, and Petra stayed where she was with the tact of someone practiced at it. Ilara's winter eyes were warm today, something in them soft and deliberate. "My son," she signed, "came back from wherever he went this morning, and something was different about him. He ate dinner. He usually doesn't eat when negotiations go badly." A pause, her hands precise and expressive. He told me the Omega Waitress had useful thoughts. I felt warmth move up my neck. "I just ask questions. That is the most useful thing anyone can do," she signed. "Then, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "All right. Do you know what you are to him?" The market smelled like apples and wood and the faint cold of approaching autumn. I looked at her hands, then at her face, then back at her hands. "I'm his mother's server," I signed. She smiled, and it was a complicated smile, layered with something only mothers carry. "Not yet," she signed. "But you will understand soon." I didn't know what to do with that. I signed, "He doesn't know I exist outside this diner. He asked Rowan your full name last night." She signed simply. "Cassian has not asked anyone's name in 3 years." She patted my hand once, brief and definite, like punctuation, and then moved past me toward the wooden bins. And the conversation was closed in that way she had, like a door gently but firmly shut. I stood there holding my apple, and thought about a man asking someone's full name in the dark. The second negotiation session happened 2 days later, and Rowan told me about it that morning over breakfast with the tone of someone reporting mildly surprising news. "He restructured the entire approach," Rowan said, dragging toast through his eggs. "Dropped Petra's framework completely, which she was gracious about considering she'd spent a week on it. Opened the session by raising the Aldenvale corridor. He looked at me with those easy, knowing eyes. Both alphas went quiet for about 30 seconds, which for those 2 is practically a standing ovation. I refilled his coffee. The Grafen Alpha asked how Cassian had identified it as the critical variable, Rowan continued. Cassian said. He paused, and something in his expression became more careful. He said it was pointed out to him by someone who understood that what people fight about is rarely what they actually need. I set the coffee pot down. He quoted me, I said, not a question. He didn't name you, Rowan said, but yes. He looked at me steadily. Lucy, I want to say something to you, and I want you to hear it as someone who has been beside Cassian for 9 years and knows him better than almost anyone. He set down his toast. He is not an easy man. The things that made him who he is are not small things. He has carried them alone for a long time because that felt safer than the alternative. A pause. I'm not warning you away. I'm telling you to be steady. Steadiness is the only thing he actually knows how to trust. I thought about standing in wind. Not fighting it, just staying upright. I'm not going anywhere, I said. I work here every day. Rowan smiled then, the full version, uncomplicated and warm. Across the booth, Alara had been watching us, and not watching us, in that way she had. When I brought her coffee, she looked up and her hands moved, just briefly, too quickly for Rowan to follow. I told you. I signed back, equally brief. You were right. She looked profoundly, serenely satisfied, and drank her coffee. From the corner booth, I felt Cassian's eyes on me. When I finally looked, he was studying his papers. But the papers, I noticed, were upside down. The trouble arrived on a Saturday, the way trouble usually does, quietly and all at once. I was clearing the corner booth after the morning rush when the 2 alphas from the border packs walked in. Not for breakfast. They had eaten earlier. I had served them myself, and they had left without incident. This was different. They came in at 11:10 with the particular energy of men who had made a decision and were committed to it, and they sat without being seated, at the counter, which was not their usual table. I recognized the Grayfin Alpha immediately. His name was Aldrich, I had learned over the week, a broad man in his 50s with a gray-streaked beard and a way of taking up space that suggested he had never once in his life been asked to make himself smaller. The Clearwater Alpha was younger, sharper-featured, named Cole. He had the eyes of someone who kept a careful count of every slight and never forgot a single entry. They were not looking at me. They were looking at Cassian's booth. Empty. This morning, Cassian and Rowan had left an hour earlier for what Petra had described, briskly, as a site assessment of the Aldenvale corridor. Alara was still there, though. She sat with her tea and a book, unhurried in the way of someone accustomed to waiting for a son who moved through the world at the speed of urgent business. She hadn't noticed them come in. I moved toward the counter naturally, refilling the nearby sugar caddy, keeping my hands busy and my attention wide. Doesn't matter what framework he builds, Cole was saying, voice low, but not low enough. An Omega's input in a territorial ruling is a liability. If Voss keeps letting her influence his approach, the other packs will question whether he's still capable of... She's a waitress, Aldrich said, with a dismissiveness so complete it had a kind of texture to it. She poured ideas into an empty moment and he was tired enough to use them. That's all it was. I want to know who she is. Cole's eyes moved across the diner slowly, and I felt the precise moment they found me. That one? The light-haired one? I set the sugar caddy down and straightened. Aldrich glanced at me with the brief, categorizing look of someone identifying furniture. Unmated Omega. Local. No pack affiliation. He looked away. She's nothing. Something cold moved through me. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something older than both. The particular sensation of being assessed and found negligible, which I had felt before, which most Omegas had felt before, which never got smaller, no matter how many times you survived it. I kept my face even. I was 3 steps toward the kitchen when I heard Cole say, "Someone should explain to Voss that bringing an unaffiliated Omega into his mother's circle creates an exploitable attachment. If his enemies wanted a way in..." I stopped. I turned around. I did it before I fully decided to. My hands were steady, which surprised me. "I'm sorry," I said, clearly enough that the low hum of the diner didn't swallow it. "I didn't quite catch all of that." Could you say the last part again? The booth went quiet. Dara, behind the counter, had frozen with a coffee pot in her hand. Raymond's face appeared in the kitchen window and disappeared immediately, which was Raymond's version of taking cover. Cole looked at me with the particular coolness of someone recalibrating a threat level upward. This isn't your conversation. You're in my diner, I said. Most conversations here involve me eventually. Aldrich turned on his stool fully to face me, and the weight of his alpha authority came with the movement, that pressure, that gravitational pull toward submission, towards smallness. I had felt it from Cassian too, that first morning, though differently. This version had no warmth underneath it. This version was purely instrumental. I breathed. I did not step back. You have been useful to Alara Voss, Aldrich said, with the measured tone of someone explaining a concept to a child. Because you have a skill she finds comforting. That is the beginning and the end of your significance here. Do not mistake proximity to power for a share of it. The diner was very quiet. I thought about what Rowan had said. Be steady. Steadiness is the only thing he actually knows how to trust. I've never mistaken the two, I said. Alara Voss is a person, not a proximity to power. She's also a guest in this establishment, and she is sitting 10 feet behind you. I let that land. I'd appreciate it if any further conversation about exploitable attachments happened somewhere that isn't within her line of sight, since she reads lips. Cole's expression shifted. He glanced involuntarily toward table 4. Alara had not looked up from her book, but her hand, I noticed, had stopped turning the page. Aldrich studied me for a long moment, with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not quite anger, not quite respect, somewhere between the two in a country I didn't have a name for yet. Then he turned back to the counter. Get me a coffee, he said. It was not an apology. It was not nothing either. I got him the coffee. My hands were still steady. I was faintly amazed by that. Cassian came back at 12:30. He came through the door the way he always did. That immediate shift in the atmosphere of the room, and his eyes went to his mother first. Always his mother first, and then to the counter where Aldrich and Cole were sitting with their coffees, and something in his expression went very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Rowan was 2 steps behind him. I watched Rowan clock the scene in about 1 second flat, and something moved across his face that was not quite alarm, but was certainly attention. Cassian walked to the counter. Aldrich, he said. Cole. He did not sit. He stood between them at a distance that was precise and deliberate, and the air around him had that quality again, the barometric thing, the pressure. But today, it had a direction to it. I wasn't expecting you here until this afternoon. We came early, Cole said. Wanted coffee. Lucy makes good coffee, Cassian said. His eyes moved to me then, and whatever he saw in my expression, I don't know what I was showing. I was trying to show nothing, made that door shift again, more decisively this time, and his jaw tightened. He looked at Rowan. Something passed between them in the way of people who have communicated through glances for years. Rowan nodded once, very slightly, and went to sit beside Alara, pulling a chair close and signing something to her, checking on her with a quietness that made something in my chest ache a little. Cassian looked back at the 2 alphas. The site assessment is complete, he said. The Aldenvale corridor has 2 sustainable access points that could be managed jointly without requiring either pact to cede territorial claim. I've had the surveyors document them. He set a folded paper on the counter between them. The proposal is straightforward. Joint management. Shared benefit. The faction currently moving through the corridor becomes a problem you face together, rather than one that exploits your division. Cole was quiet for a moment. You moved fast. I had a clear direction, Cassian said. Aldrich unfolded the paper and looked at it. His expression was unreadable. But he was reading. Genuinely reading. Not performing skepticism. That was something. We'll review it, Aldrich said finally. I'll need your answer by tomorrow morning, Cassian said. We've spent enough time in Briarwood. He said it simply, factually. and I told myself that the small drop in my stomach at those words was entirely unreasonable, and I should set it aside immediately. He turned to me then. Not the brief, functional glance he'd used for the first few days. This was direct and full, and it lasted long enough to mean something. "Can I have the booth?" he said. "It's yours," I said. He moved to the corner. I followed with coffee, and when I set it down, he looked up at me with those pale eyes and said, quietly, too low for the counter to hear, "Rowan told me what happened." I said nothing. "You didn't have to say anything to them," he said. "No," I agreed. "I didn't have to." He held my gaze. "Are you all right?" The question was so simple and so unexpected. Not was there an incident. What did they say? Do I need to manage this? Just, are you all right? That I felt it somewhere entirely different from where I usually process things. "Yes," I said honestly. I was steadier than I expected. Something crossed his face. Something warm, briefly, before the careful layers came back. "You were steady the first morning," he said. "You've been steady every morning since." I didn't have an answer for that. I didn't think he needed one. That evening, after the diner closed, and I was walking home through the tree-lined streets with the autumn cold coming down properly now, settling into the town like a decision, I let myself think about what Alara had said in the market. "You will understand soon." And I thought about Cassian asking Rowan my full name in the dark. And I thought about the way he'd said we've spent enough time in Briarwood, and the way that felt. And I made myself be honest about what the feeling was. Because the one thing I had decided about myself, somewhere between picking up the first coffee pot and facing down an alpha twice my size at a diner counter, was that I was done being small for the convenience of people who hadn't earned the space I was giving them. If something was true, I would let it be true. Even when it was inconvenient. Even when it was frightening. Even when it sat in a corner booth with pale eyes and said, "Are you all right?" like it mattered, and the terrible, honest answer was, "More than I have been in a long time, and I don't know what to do with that." I walked home through the columns of autumn light and let the feeling be exactly what it was. The answer came Sunday morning, and it came the way most important things come, without announcement, in ordinary light. Aldrich and Cole arrived at the diner at 8 o'clock. Not together, which I noted immediately. They came in separately, 3 minutes apart, and sat on opposite ends of the counter with the studied casualness of men who had made a decision and were still getting used to the weight of it. I poured their coffees without being asked. Aldrich wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the counter surface. Cole looked out the window at the street, where the autumn trees had gone fully gold overnight, as though the season had finally committed to itself. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then Aldrich said, to no one in particular, "The corridor proposal is reasonable." Cole was quiet for another moment. Then, "Joint management is workable, if the documentation is accurate." "The documentation is accurate," I said, refilling Cole's coffee. "Cassian's team surveyed it for 3 hours yesterday." Cole looked at me. Not the way he had looked at me the day before. Not that cold. Categorizing assessment. Something more uncertain. More human. "You believe in the proposal," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I believe it solves the actual problem," I said. "Which is that you both need the corridor more than you need the fight. That's not a complicated thing to see." I paused. It's just easier to see from the outside. Aldrich made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. They were still at the counter when Cassian arrived at 8:45, and what happened next was not dramatic. There was no ceremony, no formal declaration, no grand gesture of the kind that gets remembered in stories. Cassian sat between them at the counter, which was itself a statement, quiet and deliberate. And Rowan placed the survey documents between the 3 coffee mugs, and they talked. Steadily, for an hour and 20 minutes, while the diner moved around them, and Dara refilled waters, and Raymond produced eggs, and I worked my tables and tried very hard not to pay attention. I failed completely at not paying attention. At 10:15, Aldrich extended his hand across the counter to Cole. Cole looked at it for a moment that stretched slightly longer than comfortable. Then he took it. Rowan caught my eye across the diner and gave me a single small nod. Alara found me in the kitchen doorway just before 11, when the morning rush had thinned, and Raymond was on his break, and the diner had gone to that particular mid-morning quiet that I had always loved. The particular piece of a job mostly done. She touched my arm lightly to get my attention, and when I turned, she was already signing. "It's done." They agreed. I signed back. "I know." I watched. "Cassian told them the approach came from you." She signed. "This time he used your name." I felt warmth move through me that I didn't try to cool. "He didn't have to do that." I signed. "No," she agreed. "He chose to." Her hands moved with the particular care she used when she wanted to be precise. "I want to tell you something, Lucy. About my son. You may already understand some of it." A pause, her eyes steady on mine. When Cassian was 17, his father, my husband, left the pack. Not through loss, through choice. He chose power over his family, over his people, over me. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind it did. Something old and thoroughly processed. Cassian was the one who held everything together. He was too young for what it required of him, and he did it anyway. He became so good at holding things together that he forgot how to put anything down. She paused again. He has not trusted easily since then. He has not allowed anyone close who he could not also protect completely. That is not strength, Lucy. It looks like strength. But it is a man who learned that love costs more than he could survive paying twice. I thought about him sitting at the counter the day the negotiation broke down, staring at the space between his forearms. I thought about papers held upside down. "Why are you telling me this?" I signed. "Because he will not," she said simply. "And because you should know what you are choosing, if you are choosing anything." Her eyes were very clear. "I am not asking you to take care of him. He does not need that. I am asking you to be patient with the part of him that does not yet know it is safe to stop being careful." The kitchen smelled like coffee and warm butter, and the particular domestic smell of a place that feeds people every day, and I thought that there are worse things to be than someone who stands in an ordinary place and makes people feel found. "I'm not going anywhere," I signed. "I work here every day." She laughed. Actually laughed, a bright and genuine sound that I felt as much as heard. And then she pulled me into a brief, firm hug that surprised me completely. And then she stepped back and composed herself and signed with great dignity. "I know." That is exactly what I told him. He came to find me at noon. Not in the booth, not at the counter. He came to find me in the small side garden behind the diner, which was not really a garden. It was a narrow strip of pavement with 2 wooden chairs and a potted rosemary plant that Raymond had put there 3 summers ago, and then entirely ignored. I went there sometimes on slow days to get 10 minutes of sky. I was there now, sitting in one of the wooden chairs with my braid coming loose on the left side as usual, watching the gold trees move in the wind. I heard the door and knew without turning. He came and stood beside the second chair and looked at it for a moment, as though confirming it was real. And then he sat down. He was quiet for a while. The wind moved through the trees, and a single leaf came down in a slow, unhurried spiral and landed on the pavement between us. "The agreement is signed," he said. "I heard. Rowan is handling the documentation. We'll leave tomorrow." I kept my eyes on the trees. "I know." A pause. The rosemary moved slightly in the wind. "I told them your name," he said. "Your mother told me. I should have..." He stopped. Started again, in the careful way of someone choosing each word individually. "I have used other people's thinking before without acknowledging it, because I thought the source might undermine the outcome." He paused. That reasoning was wrong. It was also not the whole reason. I looked at him then. He was looking at the trees. "The other reason," he said, "is that I didn't want them to know your name because I didn't want them looking at you the way Cole looked at you yesterday. And that was—" He exhaled. "That was not my decision to make." The sky above the narrow garden was very blue, the specific blue of October, cool and absolute. "No," I said quietly. "It wasn't. I know." He turned to look at me then, fully, and in the pale eyes there was none of the careful distance, none of the contained authority. There was just a person, tired and honest, and more uncertain than he would allow himself to be anywhere else. "I have spent a long time being careful about what I let matter to me," he said, "because the things that matter become the things that can be used. I understood that before I understood almost anything else." "I know," I said, "because I did. Alara had told me, and also I had seen it in him from the beginning. The way he checked on her first, always. The way he held his own expression like something that required active maintenance. You are not careful," he said, and it wasn't a criticism. It was something closer to wonder. "You signed to a stranger in a diner without thinking about it. You argued with two alphas over a counter without calculating the risk. You said exactly what you thought to a king you'd known for 4 days. He looked at me steadily. "I have never met anyone who was less careful and more safe to be near." Something turned over in my chest, slowly and completely. "I'm not reckless," I said. "I just decided a long time ago that being small wasn't actually keeping me safe. It was just making me easier to overlook." "Yes," he said softly. "I can see that." The leaf between us moved slightly in the wind and didn't go anywhere. "I want to come back," he said, "to Briarwood. There will be follow-up work on the corridor agreement. It's legitimate. I'm not fabricating a reason." He paused. "But I want to be honest that it is not the only reason." I looked at him for a long moment. At the scar on his jaw, and the careful hands, and the winter sky eyes that were his mother's eyes, and were, underneath all the guarded weight of who he had become, surprisingly gentle. "I work here every day," I said, for the 3rd time. And this time it meant something different. This time it was an answer. Something in him changed then. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was the door again, but this time it opened. Not wide. Just enough. Just the amount of space it takes for warmth to move through. He nodded once. Then he looked back at the trees. And I looked back at the trees. And we sat in the narrow garden behind the diner with the autumn light coming down around us, and the rosemary moving in the wind, and it was quiet in the best way. The way of two people who no longer need to fill the space between them, because the space itself has become something good. Cassian left Briarwood the following morning, as he'd said. Rowan shook my hand at the door with both of his, warm and genuine, and said, "You're good at this." I knew he didn't mean waitressing. Petra gave me a brisk, sincere nod that I understood, coming from her, was the equivalent of an embrace. Alara held my face in both hands for one moment, and looked at me with those winter eyes, and then let go and walked out into the October morning without looking back, because she was the kind of person who didn't need to. Cassian was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway and looked at me across the diner, the whole length of it, past the laminated menus and the sticky syrup dispensers and the cracks in the tile floor, through the smell of burnt butter and dish soap and maple sweetness. He looked at me the way you look at something you are memorizing, and then he said simply, "Thank you, Lucy." Not for the coffee. Not for the suggestion about the corridor. For all of it, I understood. And for none of it. And for something that didn't have a name yet, but was growing steadily in the space between a king who had forgotten how to put things down, and an Omega who had decided that being overlooked was no longer something she was willing to arrange for other people's comfort. "I'll be here," I said. He nodded. He left. He came back 3 weeks later. Without Petra, without the survey documents, without the formal architecture of a diplomatic visit, just Cassian and Rowan, on a Tuesday morning, walking through the door at 7:14, while I was restocking the sugar caddies. Rowan went directly to the counter and said, the usual, with the comfort of someone returning to a place that had already decided to keep him, and I laughed and poured the coffee. Cassian walked to the corner booth. He looked at me from across the diner and raised one hand, and signed slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been practicing. Good morning. His form was imperfect. The motion was slightly wrong. It didn't matter. I felt something bloom open in my chest, warm and certain and entirely without apology. I signed back from across the room so that only he could read it. Good morning. Coffee? He smiled. It was a real one, the kind that changes the whole architecture of a face. Please, he signed. I poured the coffee. I carried it across the diner that smelled like butter and syrup and ordinary life. I set it down in front of him, and he looked up, and the window behind him was full of morning light and gold October trees. And the story was not finished. Stories like this are never quite finished. But it was, at last, fully and beautifully begun. And that, for now, was everything.